Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this important event. It's a culmination of many activities at the Posthumanism Research Institute throughout this past year, and also a culmination of our reading group on Marx and the Anthropocene. I'll hold up a copy of the book here. You can see the famous book we'll be discussing today, and we have over the past year. Our reading group worked through the book chapter by chapter since last fall. With monthly meetings, each was facilitated by an expert, either on Marxism and Marxology, or kind of more environmentally oriented focus. And we included about 20 participants from a wide range of professions and academic backgrounds. And we're also in discussion right now about potential topics to do another book next year. I'll say a bit more about that. But first, my name is Trevor Norris, and I'm the director of the Posthumanism Research Institute here at Brock University. I teach philosophy of education, and my background is and training is in political philosophy. I also wanted to introduce the Posthumanism Research Institute to any of you who are not familiar with it. So please have a look at the homepage and feel free to join us as an affiliate if you haven't already. That way you would get notifications, including about this event. We have several events planned for next year, including another potential reading group. And some topics include posthumanism in the end of liberal democracy, posthuman critiques of transhumanism and artificial intelligence, posthumanism and psychoanalysis, and more events in partnership with the Latin American Posthumanism Network. We also plan something on campus, although it would be a hybrid event, called Competing Conceptions of the Anthropocene. There are two members of the Brock University faculty who are involved in researching the debate about the word, the Anthropocene. There's a location a little bit north of the campus of the university where research is being done on a lake, looking at the sediment layers at the bottom of that lake, because it's kind of an unusual lake that preserves the changes that have happened in recent centuries quite clearly. So Francine McCarthy and Martin Head have been involved in the Anthropocene Working Group, which became quite controversial regarding the adoption of the word Anthropocene to describe our current epoch. So that event will be in person and hybrid, and the working title for that is Competing Conceptions of the Anthropocene, that will look at the debates within that working group that led to the outcome. And then we have two book sessions planned, one with Christine Daigle on Joyful Extinction, another with Mario de Paul Antonio, titled Education and Democracy at the End. But for today, as many of you know, Saito's book has been hugely impactful and widely read. It is quite a significant and impactful book and has led me to rethink much of what I believe and have believed to be true about Marx. Things are not always as they seem when it comes to the writing of Marx, and even a century and a half later, we have reason to think differently, especially in light of the publication of the revised edition of the collected works of Marx and Engels, as well as a new translation of Capital. Saito shows that Marx has been not only much maligned, but also much misunderstood and misrepresented. My own undergraduate started in 1990, just as the Cold War ended. The way that I was introduced to Marx at the time was that Marx saw nature as subordinate to humans and their productive projects. Nature was the mere raw material to be put to use. And that Marxism was just as bad as capitalism in regards to nature, because labor was the primary originator of value. And the more pressing political struggle concerned the ownership of production and the conditions of production, rather than what materials were used in the production process or the environmental consequences of production. Labor, not nature, was the revolutionary battleground. So this is my own introduction 35 odd years ago to Marx. I've been so glad to read this book and rethink that narrow view of Marx. There are many problems with that model, and I think perhaps they're most apparent or evident in today's environmental crisis. We can also see this tension between labor and nature manifested in the Canadian political landscape, where environmental concerns are seen as being in conflict with labor. In Canada, as an example, we have two very different political parties. The NDP, or the New Democratic Party, is the party of labor and unions primarily, or generally speaking. And on the other hand, we have a Green Party founded about 40 years ago. And these two parties haven't always gotten along and have quite a different focus and a different mandate and different policy positions. And unfortunately, both parties were quite hard hit in the last Canadian election last week. Part of the reason the Liberals won in Canada was not only because some Conservatives switched to Liberals out of fear of Donald Trump, but also because people that might otherwise have voted NDP or Green gave their vote to the Liberals to ensure the Conservatives didn't get in office. So, in fact, the NDP, the Labour Party, lost its official party status, quite unfortunately, which puts them in a difficult position in Parliament. So Saito's book raises some of the most important questions for our time regarding the viability of our current ways of organizing politics, our ways of measuring economic activities, and the dominant assumption that growth is imperative and incontestable. Saito questions the underlying assumptions regarding where our civilization is going or should be going, and how fast. That the focus on growth is missing out on something important, and that there are negative consequences of growth. So it's wonderful to have this opportunity to talk more about the book together. Very glad to see all of you here for this event. I did want to note that, in fact, today is Karl Marx's birthday. This was not deliberately planned when we settled on this date, May 5th, 1818, a little over 200 years ago. If any of you are on the Verso, the publisher Verso's reading list or email list, you would have got notification that there's a reduction on Marx books today. So we're going to start with Saito speaking, and then we're going to turn to about a dozen questions that are coming out of the reading group, and then we'll open it up more broadly for people to write questions in the chat. So thank you again, Professor Saito, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is Kohei from actually Germany, where Marx was born. And thank you so much for inviting me for this great opportunity today, because it's such a great pleasure for author that you guys had a very careful reading group over a year and then set up this opportunity to discuss issues and criticisms with me, and then I can also learn from you. So I was really looking forward to today's event. And yeah, I thought that after seeing you sent me many questions, so I thought that it might be better to answer those questions instead of me talking some things that you might already know. So let me briefly summarize my intellectual development. Maybe there's some kind of the background of the book, why I wrote that book, and how maybe it became popular, especially in Japan. And then we can also discuss more questions and issues together. So basically, I belong to a little younger generation as compared to Trevor. I went to college 2005, and before graduating, there was this financial crisis 2008, and that was basically the moment in that time period I was more and more politicized, and I got into more traditional working class socialist politics, and I started reading Marx and so on. But at that time, I wasn't really interested in ecological issues. So it was only after the big earthquake and the nuclear disaster in Fukushima in 2011 that I had to think about the human nature relationship, because I had a more optimistic view about technological progress, how actually socialist society maybe one day, if it's somehow established, will be able to utilize those development of technologies for the sake of improving working class life and then emancipating us from the issue of scarcity and so on. But obviously, I was paying too much attention to the issue of class inequality without paying much attention to the issue of the town and the countryside, if I borrow Marx's expression. Basically, I was born in Tokyo and grew up in Tokyo, so profiting a lot from the electricity generated in Fukushima, and then marginalizing or externalizing all the risk to the people who never used those electricity generated in Fukushima, right? So the question was obviously, will socialism still use nuclear power one day? And that's like a kind of actually the traditional question that some people already discussed in the 70s and the 80s. But this problem became very political in Japanese context at the time. So I thought that I thought at the time that Marx didn't really have a good answer to this question, because I also thought that Marx was more kind of like productivist or even Promethean, arguing for the kind of like domination over nature and so on. But when I went to the grad school in Germany, I got involved in this project of Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, the complete works of Marx and Engels, and get some information about how late Marx, especially during the process of preparing the manuscript for volume 2 and 3, especially, he intensively studied natural sciences. The beginning was, of course, the ground rent theory, but then that kind of expanded to include the issues such as soil exhaustion, excessive deforestation, and the mistreatment of animals, and even the extinction of species. And these things are all documented in his notebooks, but they were basically marginalized even by scholars, and then left unpublished for many, many years. But then the complete works are now publishing these notebooks. And basically I became one of the editor of the mega project, and then I started editing those notebooks, especially on natural sciences that Marx made while he was writing volume 1 to 3. And then basically, especially the important figure was Liebig, of course. It's John Bellamy Foster, and then those people also talk about Liebig in order to establish this concept of metabolic rift. I think my contribution was basically that I looked at new notebooks, and then after publishing volume 1 of Capital, Marx actually studied other scientists who criticized Liebig too. So, I mean, there was like some kind of tendency among Foster and those monthly review people who sort of absolutize Liebig and his theory of metabolism. But Marx was obviously conscious that Liebig didn't explain everything, and he was wrong in certain issues. So Marx felt the necessity to update his knowledge because science was developing very fast at the time. So he was reading many literature that was quite critical of Liebig. And then basically, with this process, his interest in ecology also expanded to include issues other than agriculture and so on. So the first book, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, is basically about this process of ecological formation of Karl Marx thinking. And that was, my PhD dissertation, and I was happy that I was able to finish this project. But at the same time, I got some criticism or comments and feedbacks, especially from non-Marxists, because Marxists are basically happy that I demonstrated that Marx was really serious about ecological issues, and we can update him to think about the ecological question and so on. But for non-Marxist people who are interested in, of course, ecological questions and capitalism and so on, they questioned me what's the necessity of going back to Karl Marx, because his science is, after all, based on Liebig and some other people in the 19th century. So many things are already outdated, and it's not really necessary maybe to go back to Marx and then discover that Marx was actually ecologist and so on. That's only some concern from conservative Marxists and so on. So I thought that I really had to go more than simply demonstrating that Marx was interested in ecological questions. I realized that I have to show that the Marx critique is first still useful to think about today's ecological crisis like climate change. And then also, I thought that I have to demonstrate or at least describe what kind of post-capitalism Marx was envisioning. So how eco-socialism actually looks like and so on. And in the first book, I didn't really go into that kind of discussion. So that was a limitation. And basically slow down the book, a more popular one, is an attempt to utilize Marxian framework of metabolic rift and so on to analyze today's climate crisis and criticize non-Marxist policies like Green New Deal and so on. And the Marx in the Anthropocene was a more academic version that you read, which is an attempt to go back to Marx's writings again, like notebooks again, to really reconstruct what his last vision of post-capitalism became after really studying those ecological questions. And this is, of course, the very controversial part of my argument because Marx, of course, never used degrowth, and he never really elaborated on the concept of degrowth communism. So it's really me trying to really push Marx as much as possible in the direction that I myself is interested in the 21st century, in the Anthropocene, because when I wrote Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism 2017, I was still more or less optimistic about technologies, even after nuclear disaster. I thought that, okay, maybe nuclear power plant, nuclear power is bad, but we can still use a lot of solar powers and wind turbine and other electric vehicles and many so-called green technologies to realize decarbonization project as fast as possible. And this can be accelerated with socialist planning. And then, that's why we have to overcome capitalism and so on. So it's kind of like a green socialism was my basic vision of eco-socialism. But especially after the book came out in 2019, 20, there was like a world global movement for climate justice, like Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, and these movements actually criticized Green New Deal and the green growth and so on. And they demanded more radical transformation of our way of life and the mode of production and so on. So I have some difficulty. How should I or should Marxists respond to that kind of radical movements? And then I kind of critically reflected on my naive presupposition about the possibility of green growth and so on. So I came to recognize that even though I thought that green eco-socialism was some radical idea, I accepted many capitalist ideas of modernization, technological progress, and so on, so on. And then after realizing the insufficiency of that kind of naive modernist tendency, I actually read Marx's engagement with pre-capitalist non-Western societies too. And that was actually the process that Marx was doing in the especially 70s and the 80s, reading both natural sciences and pre-capitalist non-Western societies at the same time. And then no one really investigated why Marx studied these two apparently very different spheres of knowledge together at the same time in order to finish his critical political economy. So that's how I got into this big question of last Marx. And basically, I mean, you read books, I'm not going to go into this again, but basically Marx, I think, was studying non-Western pre-capitalist societies in order to think about different ways of organizing metabolic interaction. And then he was not simply interested in how, what kind of regulations and what kind of law they had in pre-modern societies, and then how they regulated land and so on. But he was also interested in how that they also interacted with nature and how they had a more sustainable and equal relationship with others and then as well as with the environment. So one of the recognition that Marx came to recognize in the end of his life is that these non-Western societies are much more equal and much more sustainable, lasting for many, many years. Like, the Lake Crawford, the people from the Iroquois Federation lived many years, and these things have been massively destroyed, violently destroyed by primitive accumulation, and the capitalist development really changed the way we interact with nature. So he said in the end that the Western societies have to return to the higher type of an archaic type of this agricultural communal production and consumption. So I thought it was very important that Marx is saying that we have to return. It's not simply pushing the capitalist development as much as possible in order to reach socialist society, but we have to return to non-Western society, like a pre-capitalist way of communal production and consumption. And that's the conclusion that Marx reached by learning from non-Western societies. And so that's really the way how he abandoned his earlier productivist and also Eurocentric vision of historical progress. And I concluded basically that his idea became much more compatible with degrowth, decolonial vision of post-capitalism, which I called it degrowth communism. So I think it's today, yes, also outside Japan, this book became very popular, and we don't debate anymore whether Marx himself was ecologist or not. I think we can say with some confidence that Marx was deeply interested in this kind of issues of sustainability and ecology and so on. But today we have a new debate. No? Some people still say eco-modernist version of the future progress is necessary in order to be popular, in order to gain support from working class and then mobilize people. And I think that's something that, we discuss everywhere. The Green Party or Labour Party should go for that kind of direction, the green modernization, creating more jobs, and then decarbonization can be achieved through decoupling and so on. The other side, like me, no, we have to have much more radical kind of revolution of civilization, demanding degrowth transformation, and then degrowth and the communism can work together because we are both anti-capitalist, we are both critical of colonization and exploitation, unequal exchange, and so on. This debate is something that I have been doing with people like Matt Huber, and I think maybe some important question that we will discuss also today. But in any ways, I very welcome that I think the debate is making some progress, and then we can actually use Marxist framework to think about today's global ecological crisis. And I think, Marx doesn't necessarily provide the full details of how the future looks like and how we make transition to that kind of new society. But I think he is one of the few thinkers who systematically try to criticize capitalist model production and who also try to provide a new vision of the future. And I think that kind of imagination and creativity is really what we need in this kind of dark time. And I hope that you enjoyed reading my book, and now I welcome your questions and the comments and the criticism. Thank you so much.
All right, that's great. Thank you very much. Just before I start asking the questions for my reading group, you mentioned that you've been involved in working on the collected works. Can you mention the volumes you've been involved in?
Yes. So the Japanese groups, after the collapse of the Soviet and then East Germany, the project was disrupted once. And then after 1998, they started again with some internationalization, meaning that they invited foreign scholars to work together and make it more apolitical and make it more scientific. And then so some Japanese scholars also joined in editing notebooks and the manuscript of Marx and Engels. And then the volume that I mainly edited is the one in the fourth section, volume 18, which contain many notebooks on natural sciences, including, of course, Levy, but also Frass and those people that I mainly discussed in my first book, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism. And then after that, we also edited a volume 4 in the section 14, in the section 4, volume 19, so that basically the next volume, which is about economic crisis, financial crisis of 1868. And then now we are working on the volume 17. So the basically 17, 18, 19, the three volumes that the Japanese teams are now responsible, and we finished 2. And then finally, we are working on the volume 17.
And what's the topic of 17?
Oh, the 17 is basically the notebooks that the Marx prepared in writing the manuscript of 1861 to 63. So basically, in the 50s, he studied a lot of things, history, political economy, and many things. And then before writing the manuscript of 1861 to 63, he basically tried to kind of summarize his old notebooks. So this is a kind of summary notebooks of all the important previous notebooks. Yeah.
Great. Okay. And a timeline. So 18 and 19 are out, but 17 is coming soon.
In a couple of years, yes.
Yes,
Let's hope. Yes.
Okay. It's a very ambitious project, this and very important because, as we know, the works were really only published in the Soviet Union with a, as a part of a political project. So this is quite a significant shift to be issuing these, especially things that have not previously been published.
Yeah. So now these things are also becoming more and more available online. So yeah, it's called Mega Digital. So the Mega Digital. And then if you are interested, please look at that website. They are kind of great. So.
Okay. All right, thanks. So let's jump into some of the questions from the reading group. I mentioned there's about a dozen, more or less. So I'll start with the first. Who do you envision as the audience for Marx and the Anthropocene? Is it more for Marxists in hoping that they would adopt a degrowth perspective? Or is it more for degrowth activists hoping to adopt a Marxist perspective? How does that audience differ from Karl Marx's eco-socialism and or the Slowdown Manifesto? This kind of question about your intentions in your audience.
Yeah, that's, I think, the very good beginning point after my kind of summary. So basically, Slowdown is very different kind of book. It's the one that became the bestseller in Japan, selling more than 500,000 copies. So it's like a big success. And it's written in a very accessible language. And I basically wrote that book for non-Marxist and then basically people who don't know much about even ecological questions, because Japan is much more conservative society. We have less interest in climate change, and then we don't have, someone like Sanders or AOC and these kind of things. So I basically try to revive some Marxist insight into ecological questions and then contradiction of capitalism for the general audience. But the Karl Marx eco-socialism is very different. It was my first book, and then as I said, it's on dissertation. So it's I think you all wrote, many of you I think wrote a dissertation or something similar. So it's basically the same mindset as you did in the past. What are you doing now? And Marx in the Anthropocene is, of course, a similar, more academic version. So, it's a university press, and then basically I wrote some journal articles, and then, these are very academic kind of book. But I think it's important to say that this audience is more Marxist rather than degrowth people. So after publishing Karl Marx Eco-Socialism, I really learned a lot from degrowth people. A lot of conversation that I joined, participated in some movements, and it really transformed, as I said, from more pro-Green New Deal perspective to more degrowth perspective. So it was basically an attempt to sort of convert my fellow Marxist socialist friends to learn together from degrowth people, because I was really stressed with this antagonism between some Marxist socialists on the one hand and degrowth people on the other hand. And I thought that maybe if I say Marx was also interested in that kind of question, some people may also change their mind about degrowth, and they also try to learn more from degrowth people. But the problem is, just one last thing, is that some degrowth friends got pissed off because of my attempt to claim that Marx was actually degrowth before all those degrowth people in the 20th century. So he was like, they thought that I was saying that, oh, Marx is actually greater because he knew about degrowth already at that time and so on. It was not my intention, though. It was more like how we can reread Marx after learning a lot from the ecofeminist degrowth movements. And so that's a kind of an invitation to begin a new dialogue with all the green ecological people together.
Good. So it seems it came out of those conversations, and perhaps also working with the notebooks and editing that volume as well.
Yeah. So I was editing those notebooks, but then at the time I was not really so, as I said, not paying much attention to the growth aspect. I was simply saying that Marx was interested in those the question of sustainability, if I put it in a very simple way. And then people like Kevin Anderson was working on the non-Western society and more decolonial perspective of Marx's intellectual development. And then, these two things both deal with late Marx, but then they were just not connected to each other. And so I thought that why don't we try to combine them? And then I think the degrowth communism is a very good term to capture certain aspect of his last endeavor to update his own project. And I think I'm very glad, even though I get a lot of criticism from eco-modernist people, but especially Monthly Review also now talks about degrowth, even though they don't agree with my interpretation of late Marx. They do think that the degrowth, eco-socialist degrowth, is the direction that we should seek after in the Anthropocene, basically. So I think that made debate flow into the right direction. So I'm very happy that I wrote that book. Yeah.
Good. Okay, let's move to number 2. What led you to use an exegetical reading of Marx in the pursuit of degrowth communism? Do you think that this method is the most effective for degrowth communism? Would it be possible to develop a degrowth communism if your exegetical interpretation of Marx's late notebooks was incorrect, or if Marx was ultimately in favor of focus on production? In other words, a Marxism that would be contradictory or contrary to Marx himself.
Yeah, so maybe some people think that, I'm trying to defend Marx, whatever means, by even digging up all those unpublished notebooks that no one actually care about, and why is it so important to defend that the Marx is actually even thinking about degrowth and so on. So that's actually not the direction I actually want to goal, actually. I mean, I honestly admit that the Marx was wrong in many things, many topics, and in many points, he's contradictory, he's ambivalent, because he was thinking really hard. He's trying to update his ideas. So he was much more also optimistic about technology and productivist, and he was also more Eurocentric. And then even, you know, in the 70s and the 80s, you can find some problematic remarks about women and race and so on. So of course he was, after all, European white male and so on. But at the same time, he was quite conscious of his own limitations, and he was also trying to learn new things, and I think that's great. And so I'm not saying that Marx gave all the correct answers to all the questions, but we can actually kind of, first of all, it's interesting to see how far he went with those new studies, right? And then this process is fun because we can actually also learn how it's necessary to overcome those problematic assumptions about productivism and Eurocentrism and so on. Because this is also often the question that we often still have, right? We still think that some kind of the capitalist development prepares the condition for more sustainable futures. India and China, all of those countries are still barbaric, and they have to be democratized and modernized. And this is often like sometimes very problematic assumption. Maybe it's actually those countries in the global north that have to learn from global south, or we might have to learn from those indigenous people, as Marx tried to do. So I think there are some common points that we still struggle to overcome. And then, so basically, it's a kind of way of me, myself, trying to think with Marx to overcome my own limitation, my own earlier productivist views and so on. And I think these are also very important for other, as I said, other people especially among socialists and Marxists who are often still very productivist and so on. And so I'm not saying that everyone has to read Marx notebooks in order to, come up with the correct understanding about post-capitalism. People can just, maybe come to the same conclusion as I do without reading Marx, because Degrowth people, even though not everyone is anti-capitalist, maybe, but then some of them are quite close to what I actually also advocate. Maybe one thing that's different from mainstream degrowth people is that I still do think that the development of technological force, or development of productive forces, is important to some extent. I'm not saying that we should go back to nature. It's not primitive communism, but it's also very different from just simply maximizing productive forces is always good and so on. Nuclear fusion, and these are kind of like too optimistic for me. So, but that doesn't negate the necessity of developing productive forces to some extent. And I think that's what Marx meant when he was saying that we have to return to a higher form of archaic type of production and consumption. But anyway, so yes, I think that you can still argue that Marx was wrong in many aspects, but at the same time, he was conscious of these limitations. And even if he was wrong, we can, of course, update. But it's important to read his attempt much more carefully before simply abandoning his ideas, because, as I said in the introduction, his idea is a very precious resources to think about capitalism in a systematic manner, and also to imagine some radical future that is beyond capitalist model production.
That may help actually lead into the next question. Your project
good.
starts to bring to light Marx's later understanding of the metabolic rift. Do you think people's understanding and regard for Marx will move past the Communist Manifesto and Capital to embrace this new thread? Or will people forever see him through the lens of describing exploited laborers?
Yeah, so basically, I think what I'm trying to do is to change people's image of Marx and socialism too, and communism. So that's why also the one reason why I wrote this book, Slow Down, for the general audience, because many people do suffer from poverty, inequality, and they don't like their jobs, and they feel insecure about the future. And they worry about climate change and so on, but they don't have a good image of alternatives. And I think one of the reasons why they don't have alternatives is that they simply exclude those Marxist socialist ideas from the beginning. It's not just available in the mainstream media and so on. So that's why I decided to write a popular book, which became actually successful. That's why I now appear on, say, like Japanese TV and radio and so on. And I consciously use those words like exploitation or metabolic rift or the necessity of socialism and so on, so that many people think that okay, these ideas are not actually that outdated because this guy still use those words, and then what he says seem to make sense and so on. So I think it's very important to fight it's a kind of Gramscian counter strategy to change our common sense, right? So it's very important to update this old productivist image of Marx, especially in the Communist Manifesto, because this is what we usually read in the undergrad classes and seminars. Of course, it's a very beautiful text and it's fun to read, but at the same time, it's something that Marx wrote when he was like really young, and his intellectual journey actually begins after this failure of the revolution in 1848. So he really struggled to finish even volume 1 of Capital. I'm not saying that we have to, as I said, I mean, we don't have to read all those notebooks, but I think we still have to read volume 1. And I think I welcome this new translation of volume 1. If you read that, we can already update a lot of things. And then metabolic rift, like his understanding of metabolic rift is clearly documented already in volume 1. And I think just people start talking about that kind of thing clearly changes our image of Marx, right? And then I think it's good to change once in a while what we focus on Marx. So in the 70s, Althusser and people, Marcuse, or even earlier, that some people read young Marx to criticize Soviet Stalinist Marx. I think that was important to philosophize Marx, to differentiate themselves, especially Western Marxism, from more dogmatic, traditional Soviet Marxism and so on. And then they had a more deterministic view and so on. That's why Western Marxists try to go back to young Marx, and then they try to philosophize Marx, which is good. But at the same time, they have a limitation. And I think what I'm trying to do is then why don't we focus on late Marx instead of young Marx? And late Marx also has interesting project going on, which he wasn't able to really formulate in a very clear way because he was sick and he had some difficulties and so on. But I think today's situation is radically different from Marcuse's time. So I think it's good to, we don't have to worry so much about Communist Party and so on. And we should more worry about ecological crisis. So I think this ecological focus on reading Marx makes a lot of more sense. And I think if we do this in this way, people are also interested in hearing that kind of new interpretation and new ideas. So I hope that the younger generations are more open to talking about or studying, this kind of like radical literature, and then so that we can build much more, this critical study of capitalism, environment, and so on.
It's funny you mention it. I just have read beside me this book, Soviet Marxism. The exact book you've been mentioning. Okay, so that's really helpful as well. There is a continuity to the questions. You may have noticed a bit of a pattern. So let me move on to the next. The push to green is particularly challenging on ideological grounds already. For example, fans of technological determinism might say that we need to just keep innovating new products to get us out of the position that we're in. If we introduce Marxism into this realm, that will probably turn people away. How can we spread the word of what Marx is trying to say in a world that is so hostile to Marxism more generally?
Well, I think, it depends on the country and depends on the audience too. But what I wanted to say was, at least my example is maybe hope, right? I not only talk about communism, I talk about degrowth communism. This is like the two most negative words that you can imagine maybe, and I combined together, and then the book was actually very successful. So maybe sometimes people want that kind of radical ideas. And it's not just me, but for example, David Graeber wrote about those very radical ideas, and he has also many bestsellers and so on. So it's of course, I'm not saying that everyone should talk more about the degrowth communism, and in certain occasions it's just stupid. But at the same time, it's meaningful to talk about socialism or Marxism, because otherwise it just becomes so just a liberal. I think the decline of Japanese Marxism in the last 30 years, especially after the collapse of Soviet Union, is basically that Japan had a very strong tradition of Marxian economics. But what they did is basically they tried to integrate some neoclassical ideas so that they can be more scientific or whatever. But what happened is basically then many people criticize, then why do we have to study Marxian economics? Because you guys now look almost like neoclassical economics. So it's really, they try to be more approachable, and then they basically demolish their own foundation, uniqueness. So I think one of the way is that, of course, it's hard time for the left, and especially Marxism and so on, or we have to talk more about growth, more material abundance, because these are the things that the people care. But if we talk about producing more electric vehicles and maybe extracting more oil, and you don't really differ from just mainstream people, and then you also lose your supporters too. So I think it's because the crisis is gonna accelerate, crisis is gonna continue. In that sense, there will be more desire for radical thinking. And then my point is basically, since the left is already so unpopular today, we don't have to care about being more popular. We just, be more. Also, there's a necessity to become more radical. And I think one of the problems for me with this eco-modernist idea is that they are not radical enough, because they just accept many conventional values like progress, abundance, affluence, and so on, without, I think being radical means we really have to question what the meaning of abundance is. And it's not about consumptionist abundance. We should talk more about public luxury or communal luxury, the abundance of common goods, or we should talk more about, different kind of freedom, different kind of relationship with nature and so on. I think that's the radical politics that we have to keep thinking. And I hope that one of the Degrowth communism provides some inspiration for thinking about that kind of radical imagination.
Good. Okay. Well, let's get into something concrete. You recall the story of of guano to describe how metabolic rift could be understood in Marx's day. What kind of contemporary example would you give to present day society to demonstrate this same idea of metabolic rift?
Oh yeah, many simple ideas. It's sometimes so simple that you don't even have to use metabolic rift concept maybe. But the one example is obviously carbon disruption, carbon rift. Basically that we have been extracting so much oil and fossil gases that have been accumulating underground for many years, and we just like extracting the using, and then this totally disrupted carbon cycle. And that's rift, right? And then the nitrogen rift is basically the same, that we have been basically burning so much natural gas to produce the ammonia with the Haber-Bosch method. And then basically using that, we are creating the chemical fertilizer and then just spreading all over the soil, producing lots of things. Of course, useful and important, but at the same time, too much of this is creating this rupture of nitrogen cycle too. So this is also another example of metabolic rift. And the other example, especially in context of the Latin America, because guano is a very Latin American thing. Today, the lithium and basically lithium is one of the most intensively sought after minerals in the global south for the sake of greening capitalism, right? So this is really the same, that how in order to sustain certain kind of capitalist cycle in the global north in the 19th century, basically guano was taken over. And then today lithium, of course, but also cobalt and then copper and all those things are severely extracted from the global south. So this is all those examples that have been continuing. And we can, of course, use other concepts like unequal exchange, ecologically unequal exchange. So I'm not saying that we just have to have a metabolic rift to understand this kind of phenomena. But at the same time, Marx has this kind of concept, so why don't we use it? It's very helpful to connect to capital accumulation and global north-south extraction, and then metabolic cycle. And these are also things that the Marx tried to think about, and I think these are very helpful to conceptualize the flow and
Yeah, it's a very helpful concept. Okay, I have a more detailed question. There seems to be a tension relating to time and change in the book that I'm hoping you can explain. There is, on the one hand, a sense of developmental and evolutionary change present, specifically in your re-narration of Marx as himself an evolving and unfinished thinker. Right. You focus on Marx's later notebooks to trace the developing thought of Marx to find an increasingly ecologically attuned Marx. Alternatively, your own return to Marx as a way to address the problematic situation of the early 21st century does not seem to also entail the same development or evolutionary aspect. Instead, such a wholesale return to Marx reads as if you intend Marx, quote, correctly understood, to be a stable meta-narrative structure to which our moment of time ought to become a supplicant to. A question arising out of this is, how might you think about bringing these two senses of time that occur in the book together? Or is one of them the dominant formation of time that you think severs us in the Anthropocene moment?
Okay, I see. Yes. I mean, when I read Marx, I try to emphasize how he changed and he became more ecological, but he wasn't able to finish, and it's more about evolution and change and so on. But when I try to talk about today's climate change, maybe I say, okay, degrowth communism is the answer, and we just have to follow the answer that Marx gave, because this is the correct way of reading Marx. But I think today I try to actually tell my own personal narrative, the personal evolutionary story, that I was not paying attention to ecological issue when I was an undergrad. And then because of the experience in Fukushima, I mean, I was not living in Fukushima, but because of the experience related to Fukushima, I became more ecological. But at the same time, I was still optimistic about technological progress for decarbonization, for example. And then I encountered new criticism from Fridays for Future, Greta, or Fridays Extinction Rebellion. I became more critical of my own earlier optimistic assumption of green growth, green development. And then I came to read Marx as degrowth communist. So this is really me changing, and then my reading of Marx is also changing. And yes, when I write a book, I have to sound kind of convincing. So I have to say, oh, this is the right Marx, this is the way to go, and this is the answer. Especially in the slow down, this is you're gonna be Slow Down is a book for a general audience. It's more like you have to be really confident. It's the only solution and so on. I mean, it's not a very academic in a sense. It's more political. So that's manifesto, right? Mm-hmm. But yes, underlying is actually it's the same. I think as Marx changed, I also learned that I can change, or I should change over time, because the analysis or the objective analysis, which is capitalism and climate change and so on, these issues are also changing very rapidly. So yes, I'm trying to change myself, and I'm also now updating, because the Slow Down book is originally published in 2020, almost 5 years ago. And now I'm writing another book which focuses more on kind of top-down and a more state-oriented kind of solution, because now I think the situation is getting really bad. 1.5 degrees Celsius gone. We are overshooting, and with rising populism and so on, the situation became really bad in the last 5 years. So you will read maybe the next book again. I'm changing, and I thought, yes, it's a lot of change, and I think we should change. We should learn new things. And I'm not. So my point is basically, yes, reader often get the impression that I'm saying that the Marx is this Marx, my Marx is correct, and the Marx actually anticipated everything. But my intention is actually quite opposite.
Right, Marx is not a prophet.
Exactly not, but yeah, sometimes people get the impression because I'm reading those notebooks and
Okay, shorter question, kind of building on this. One of the themes in the questions has been about the role of communism. So in chapter 6, which is one of the last chapters, you work quite hard on redescribing communism in communalist terms. Why did you feel the need to retain the term communism? Why not end the subtitle of the book towards the idea of degrowth communalism?
Yeah, yes, this is also the question that sometimes I get from both from communist side, basically that my communism is not really communism, because I don't talk enough about, say, class struggle, and then my vision is more like communalism and so on. But I will also get the criticism from non-Marxist people. Why do you use communism? Because it becomes more scary, and it becomes unattractive and so on. Okay, I mean, that's kind of true. I think that my original attempt was basically to update Marx. So Marx didn't really distinguish communism and socialism. So I decided to use that one, communism, because in the book I emphasize the importance of commons and the common. So I think the communism is a society. I mean, basically capitalism is a society in which the logic of capitalism penetrates all the spheres of life and production. So the communism is a society that the logic of common basically becomes more dominant, right? So I mean that was a very simple intention originally, and basically I wanted to change, as I said, people's kind of common sense about communism, because I think without using the term communism or socialism, people have lost imagination of post-capitalism. And I thought that using communism today again might kind of revive post-capitalist imaginary. But I admit that kind of the interpretation of communism maybe deflationary idea of communism. So I mean, some people can of course criticize, and if you don't like the word communism, you can of course use another term. But I just basically use this term because I'm a Marxist, and I wanted to change people's idea of communism intentionally.
I do have another question on a similar topic, which is the use of the word communism. It's a longer, more detailed one, but different aspects. Okay, so I'm in complete agreement with you about the need for an alternative to capitalism in its present form. And I agree as well that the best name for this alternative is communism. And yet for liberals, conservatives, as well as many post-structuralists and post-humanists, the idea of communism is indistinguishable from state socialism, from Leninism as a political strategy organized around a party, and Stalinism as a mode of governance centered on the state. Communism, we're told, is intrinsically statist and totalitarian. It is humanist and productivist. It is the enemy of openness, contingency, and difference. It traffics in rationalist abstractions, oppressive teleologies, and is opposed to the rich texture and spontaneity of the local. This is partly, to be sure, a problem of political and historical illiteracy. These groups tend to project onto both the Marxist and the communist tradition a unity that it has never had, and simply occlude the non-Stalinist communisms, from Gramsci, for example, to Guattari and many, many others, some of them you talk about in your book, actually, that have always played an important role in resisting authoritarianism in all of its shapes and sizes. At the same time, these reservations come from a valid critique of actually existing communism and its many shortcomings. Why is it today that you choose to locate your politics within the signifier communist? I mean, you partly address this, but they're asking for a different reasons. Why is it you locate your politics within the signifier communist rather than less controversial alternatives, say something like communalism or eco-socialism? How do you respond to the social democrats, post-structuralists, eco-ethicists, and others who feel the term communist has been so contaminated by its association with state socialism that it is no longer usable today strategically around which to rally an effective politics? Also, what is it that makes your work distinctly communist rather than anarchist or socialist?
It's a good question. I think, so there are, I totally understand this oppressive nature of state, but it's also state socialism, right? So even if I use socialism, it's immediately associated with state socialism and so on. Now, maybe at the beginning it was because I wanted to avoid this image of state socialism that I wanted to use communism part, because my interpretation of Marx communism it's clearly closer to anarchist tradition. So you can even say it's a kind of anarchist communism. And that is why I think that I wanted to sort of emphasize this image of communism becomes more like communes, and it's kind of like also anti-state groups and so on. So I mean, in my image, socialism has more top-down, and then communism is more kind of anarchist, bottom-up image. I mean, so it all depends what you imagine. So I mean, you cannot have a kind of like a peaceful, perfect image. It's the same with degrowth, right? I mean, people ask me, why do you use degrowth? Degrowth is such a negative part. It's like a frugality, poverty, austerity. Now, why do you choose? But we don't have another good word that can replace degrowth, and it's really hard. I think it's the same with communism or socialism. If we say communalism, we immediately lose this anti-capitalist image. It really, I think one thing I really love about communism or socialism is basically it really makes it clear that capitalism is the real root problem of today's issues. And if you say communism, communalism, or degrowth alone, it makes it really unclear, because degrowth can be some kind of stationary, market-oriented society that can be somehow compatible with maybe capitalism, right? So I think communism or socialism makes it really clear. And I admit that the Stalinism and many bad things all happened and so on. But at the same time, there are people, of course, Gramsci, but Lukács, Marcuse, and all those people up to Antonio Negri, who kept using the term, communism to criticize Stalinism, but still hope for or fight for some kind of utopian society, some kind of human emancipation, and they even sometimes risk their, of course, jobs, but even life and so on. Right? So I think it is this continuous, this long history of fight and struggle, which includes this anti-Stalinist aspect. It's something that I, as a Marxist, should not forget, and I want to preserve this kind of respect for those people who fought for this kind of emancipation. And one interesting thing is this mega, Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe. I'm editing these notebooks, and then the first project, this is often called the new mega, because there's the first mega in the 20s and 30s, which was, of course, disrupted by Stalinism. And this director, Ryazanov, was, basically killed by Stalin. And these are the people who really try to publish many things about Marx so that people can actually learn from it. And then Stalin found it's dangerous because, these are new things. And then that's why this project was destroyed. And then there was a possibility that the Nazis during the World War II might simply take all those manuscripts and notebooks and then they just burn and so on. And that's why it was some socialists really tried to preserve the manuscripts and they escaped to Amsterdam and so on. So these are really the people who try to, fought for presenting or preserving these manuscripts so that, later generation can learn from what Marx was trying to do, so that we can actually, maybe the future generation can establish socialism or communism. And then now, yes, many bad things happened, and many bad things are still happening, but maybe one day we can still realize all those endeavors that did not go in vain.
There really is a constant danger of radical projects being appropriated and minimized and kind of de-radicalized by capitalism, whether they be technological solutions or anything else. And I think this strategy of adopting the word communism kind of unambiguously communicates that what you're advocating for is not something that can be easily incorporated into existing structures without a radical change of those structures.
But the problem is now the book became so popular in Japan that some left-wing people in Japan criticize me for basically selling out, and then even communism is incorporated to some kind of commodity and so on and so on. So I mean, yes, I mean capitalism is really strong and elastic, but yes, my intention is basically not in order to be so easily incorporated into capitalist and de-radicalize and so on.
Right, and so because your book is selling widely, that must mean you're a capitalist.
So that's a lot of that kind of criticism and so on. But we can.
Okay, a shorter question and a different topic. Does your argument simply interpret, or does it help us, quote, change the world in the way that Marx insisted in the 11 Theses on Feuerbach?
Yes, of course reinterpret Marx, but my intention is to change the world, and that is why always my project is driven by my interest in the current issues like climate change, right? So once I got a comment that I'm lucky because what I study or what I do research is so connected to contemporary issues. I mean, it's not often the case, right? If we study philosophy, if you read Schelling, if you read Kant, or if you read Spinoza, it's not so easy to connect what Schelling was saying about nature to current ecological questions. Maybe there are some people who is like that, but it's not always so easy to talk about the Kantian postulate to imagine and so on. So he was saying that I'm lucky because what I study is so much had so much relevance to today's issues and so on. But I said, no, it's not the case. It's not I'm lucky because I was intentionally rereading Marx with some political interest in contemporary situation, and I was looking for some kind of not answer maybe, but some kind of hint to think about today's issues with critical perspective and so on. And there's a danger, of course, because I'm really imposing. I admit I'm imposing certain interest, like my own personal interest, upon Marx. Maybe I'm overemphasizing certain aspects because I'm so much interested in degrowth, because degrowth is now for me politically important, and I'm pushing Marx too far, and so on. So I totally recognize this tension too. But at the same time, I think this for me means that we cannot read Marx for the sake of simply writing a journal article and so on, right? So for me, it's not simply about interpreting Marx, but about changing the world. That yes, and following the spirit of the 11 Theses on Feuerbach.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. Would degrowth communism advocate for a return to communal property? What would this look like in political terms? If not a return to pre-capitalist utopian communities, then what? For example, in the current context, would degrowth communism advocate for something like basic income? Or is that not enough, I guess, meaning not radical enough?
Yeah, so one important thing is, sometimes, I already pointed out, but there's also often this misunderstanding that degrowth communism is about returning to this primitive communism, like a kind of nature harmony, utopia, and so on. It's not the case, right? I mean, obviously, it's not possible and it's not desirable. Marx was never anti-technology, so we should, of course, utilize solar power, renewable energies, electric vehicles, because without these technologies, we cannot decarbonize the economy for sure. So I'm not denying the importance of those technological progress. That doesn't mean the technology solves everything, right? So there's a distinction, basically. I mean, we have to be critical of technologies because technology can be a tool for dominating nature and people. And there are technologies that can be utilized for the sake of some tech oligarchs and so on. That is the issues that we are witnessing today, basically. And so the point is we have to imagine the new technology that can be utilized as communal property, meaning that it can be democratically managed and so on. And for example, it's very hard to imagine nuclear power plants being democratically managed. It's not possible because of security reason, and it's not possible because of this gigantic size and so on. But we can totally imagine that the solar panels, the renewable energies being democratically managed. It's more decentralized and so on. So I think these are the distinctions that, I mean, this is just one easy example, but these are the ways that we can imagine the future direction. It's the same with car. I'm not saying that the electric vehicles are bad, right? I mean, but the electric vehicles alone are not solutions. Like if everyone in America keeps driving these gigantic cars, it's not solution. It's more simply distraction. So it's necessary to communalize cars, meaning that we can share, but also we invest, of course, more in public transportation. And these are some kind of communal property. And in that sense, I'm not saying that we should totally abolish commodity and money immediately. I mean, which is impossible. So we first have to start with basically decommodifying basic goods and services that we really need for living. But the capitalism basically produces what's more profitable. So there's overproduction of what we don't actually need or what we cannot afford, while there's a underconsumption or underproduction of what we actually do need and so on. So the communism or socialism basically aim to focus more on what we need instead of what is profitable. And that's a real kind of shift or transformation from growth-oriented capitalism to degrowth, non-capitalism and so on. And in that sense, yes, in the future society, there will be money and commodity, at least for a long time. And the basic income could be one part of the solution. But my point is basically the basic income is not radical in the sense that it imposes, well, it too naively accepts the power of money in capitalism. So basic income is based on the power of money in capitalism. And then it's kind of fetishized view, oh, money is powerful, so why don't we distribute this powerful commodity so that everyone can be more secured and affluent and so on. But I don't think that's radical because it really naively accepts the capitalist relationship. Decommodification is much more radical because it really goes against the logic of commodity and money. And in that sense, I am a supporter of basic services than basic income. Even though, I mean, after the commodifying many things like healthcare, education, public transportation, internet, and so on, maybe basic income might even expand or supplement the basic services. But I think the first step is basic service rather than basic income.
Okay, well, kind of building on that in terms of, concrete practical strategies within the constraints that will currently exist. So the question is, what movement, if any, are you envisioning? Would degrowth communism include models like basic income or part-time for all proposals for a care-based economy, for example, by Jennifer Nadelsky and Tom Mallison? More generally, what are your views on movement building and the role, if any, of alliances and coalitions with other anti-capitalist and degrowth struggles that may not necessarily identify as being communist?
Right. So I think that when we build, this kind of alliance, it's not necessary to kind of stick to this communist identity. I mean, but I think this, if you stop identifying communism with state socialism, Stalinism, and all these kind of scary, oppressive, productivist Marxism, and you reinterpret communism as simply this degrowth agenda of decolonial ecological project of building commons, it naturally opens up the possibility of building alliance with care-based economy, ecofeminist movements, and all the kind of indigenous movements and so on. And I think that really builds new way of imagining some kind of emancipatory movement without falling into productivist agenda. And I think the problem is, of course, it's not so easy to imagine that kind of radical demand becomes so popular. I think that's a problem with degrowth, right? Degrowth becomes always very local, some like a transition town, eco-villages, and some cooperatives. And there are small examples, but they are not enough to really transform this global system of capitalism. And then it's really hard to imagine how like American working class people identify themselves with degrowth and so on. So I totally do admit the difficulty. And I think this is not the task of, let's say, philosopher to come up with this concrete terms, concrete policies to effectively intervene in the current conjunction, how we can mobilize the working class and so on. Of course, I mean, it's not something that I'm not saying that I don't have to think about those questions because I'm a philosopher and so on, but I do think, but it's not like the project that I'm trying to do is at least about really changing first the mindset or the theoretical framework or worldview of socialists and the Marxists. First, they really have to change, like myself, and I'm still trying to learn and I'm trying to change myself. Really have to change these old ideas of the state of socialism and so on, so that it's possible to start building exactly this kind of alliance with care-based, more kind of part-time for all kind of movements. Maybe not quite sure about basic income, but many things that are important. And so that's one first. In that sense, it's a first step, the first invitation to think about different kind of things. And I actually even think that it's possible, even though in the book Marx in the Anthropocene, I defend certain kind of anthropocentric analysis, like dualism and so on. But I think it's totally compatible in certain sense with ecofeminist, posthumanist, ecological movements. Once we agree with the necessity of also overcoming capitalism.
Good. Okay. A lot of this, what you've been commenting about, I think connects with the idea of the role of the state. So there's a question here about the state. On the one hand, you seem to favor grassroots, communal, cooperative initiatives that are linked, but operate in the context of a weak state, which would be kind of a libertarian model, but also of a fairly robust state with a regulatory power. However, this seems to suggest a socialist or social democratic model rather than a communist model requiring revolution. So can you clarify where you stand on this, which I think opens up the question for what you could see as the role of the state?
Yeah, so I mean, I totally admit that, for example, in the book Slow Down, I focus mainly on grassroots movements as an attempt to build or revive commons, and then it's I don't really talk about the role of the state, and that's mainly because in the conservative societies like Japan, I wasn't able to see the kind of some kind of a big social movements that can mobilize the party and so on. So it was kind of attempt to empower people to start something new, to build commons like daily communism kind of thing, that they can also do something to some kind of anti-capitalist project and so on. But honestly, I have to admit, especially after 5 years now, the situation is getting bad, and then it's not enough to build that kind of small local communities. And I think that's also the limitation of degrowth framework. As I said, they are often small scale local communities without changing global capitalism. And I think that's why it's important to combine degrowth communism. I mean, I don't clearly distinguish communism and socialism. So I think the socialist tradition can help degrowth movements. I mean, socialism has a lot of experience and a tradition and a theories of mobilizing, transforming the system, including socialist calculation debate and so on. So it's about how we can actually scale up and then transform, introduce some kind of planning to make a transition to post-capitalism and so on. So the book that I'm currently working on is more top-down, more about how socialist tradition is helpful to, or is necessary to think about this permanent crisis of climate collapse that becomes increasingly unavoidable in the coming future, right? So yes, this is a very good question because I didn't discuss this issue. And then even if I publish this new book on this kind of top-down state intervention to mitigate the issue, there remains a tension. I think it's top-down is always dangerous because it's dangerous of totalitarianism and so on. And then the bottom-up is always marginalized, too small, and so there's always this tension. But I think there's no peaceful solution. I think we have to stick to these tensions. And I think, of course, that top-down intervention doesn't work without mobilizing people. So I think both aspects are quite important. I'm still trying to think. And I think it's similar. Andreas Mann has two books. One is on ecological Leninism and the war communism, and the other one is about how to grow a pipeline. And his one book is about really top-down thing, and then the other one is really bottom-up resistance against fossil capital and so on, right? So I think that kind of dualism is, now I totally understand. It's really hard to imagine, so it's hard to solve this tension theoretically. But I think if you look at the practice, Andres Mann's favorite example recently is Colombia. Especially in Latin America, we do witness certain fusion or synthesis of grassroots, more mass mobilization with transforming the political system, electing the president, Petro, and this kind of like dynamics do exist. So maybe that's something that we should actually learn from the global south.
Okay, well, we're nearing the end, but we have two more questions. The last one would be about Japan, but this next question is about the concept of teleology or teleological understanding. Okay, so you describe a post-capitalist degrowth future in which we will enjoy a form of, quote, abundance that is not characterized by, quote, the satisfaction of unlimited desires. On the contrary, you frequently use the language of limits, constraints, and regulation to describe how this new form of abundance would be experienced. At times, you talk about these regulations as being democratically or socially imposed. At other times, you speak of individuals, quote, autonomously self-limiting their production and consumption. You insist, moreover, that this sort of a constraint would not be experienced as a burden, but rather as a liberation. This all sounds rather Aristotelian. Are you not smuggling a teleological understanding of human nature and human flourishing into your philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, that limit thing, again, I was influenced by especially Yorgos Kallis. He is a degrowth scholar, originally from Greece, and then now he's teaching in Barcelona. He has a book, Limit, why Marxism was wrong and then why it matters or something like that. And then that book is really about self-limitation. And then the idea basically goes back to Castoriadis, who talks about limit as autonomy. Autonomy basically means that they use self-imposed laws, and that's the kind of activity of limiting is not necessarily constraints, but it's an expression of freedom and so on. And then that's of course something that you can find in Kant, but also in Aristotle. And this is maybe the thing that yeah, I mean, it sounds Aristotelian, and the meaning is, I'm not sure if this is a bad thing or not, so it's hard to say. But I think what I wanted to do is basically that exactly this changing the image. So first, abundance as some kind of communal abundance instead of abundance of commodities, of abundance of money. And these are one transformation of our common concept in capitalism. The other one is, yes, freedom, right? Freedom is often associated with liberal freedom from any constraints, but we can, of course, go back to other tradition of more positive freedom or social freedom, or even qualitative freedom instead of quantitative freedom, that we can actually, instead of having always hundreds of thousands of genes, we can actually choose from 10 genes, and that actually increases our qualitative freedom, right? So these are the things that I think we should, I think that's how philosophy is very useful. I think often people say that philosophy is useless, but I do think that the philosophy gives us some conceptual tools to critically overcome this conventional understanding of freedom of abundance or anything, to imagine different kind of abundance. And I totally understand this is, I'm just playing with words, and I'm trying to deceive people that it's actually constrained, but I'm trying to make it sound better and so on. But if you understand it, it's really not the case. If you really understand it, it do sound, it do become really attractive, right? So I think this is an interesting dynamics that you play, and it's the same. I think when I first heard degrowth, I thought it was such an unattractive concept, but then now you understand it, and then degrowth becomes such an attractive, useful concept. But I understand it's kind of hard to convince other people. I'm trying. I still haven't given up, but yes, I totally understand that it's not an easy thing, and especially in America, it's so hard. I always get many criticisms, but you're Canadian, so it might be different.
Yeah, well, we're somewhat different, but not so far apart. Yeah, further, I hope. Okay, last question then. Speaking of national context, so one of our members is a psychoanalyst in Mexico and asked this question. The question is about the context in which the book is written. In Mexico, following the uprising of the Zapatistas, there has been a lot of discussion within the Marxists who had a different perspective from the communists and who did not take into consideration the cultural differences that were so deeply ingrained within the movement. The Zapatistas do not entirely subscribe to the Marxist tradition, although they oppose capitalism, but they do organize collectively because they understand the social reality very differently. So the question is, how have Marxists in Japan received the book? And are there any other communities in Japan that question the Marxist tradition?
Yes, so one thing about Japan is, even though it's conservative, especially after the World War II, there was a very strong tradition of academic Marxism. Universities and even Department of Economics was occupied by Marxian economics for so many years. So if you talk to people who are now like 50s, 60s, 70s, they all read some kind of Marxist text and then took courses on Marxist economics at college. So they actually, you know, now work in big companies and so on. They do have some Marxist understanding, and they do welcome my book because they enjoy reading it. It's not that they are radical. They don't, you know, they're basically conservative. They graduate from good universities and they work in the big companies, but they, you know, kind of remember what they learned at the university, and now with some update on ecology and so on. So they do like my reading. But they never vote for Communist Party, for example. But this Communist Party, Japan, has a very unique relationship with me. They are one of the few exceptions in the world that they still have the national parliament seats. And then they still do talk about Marx and so on. But interestingly, their newspapers or the politicians from the party never mention my name. They don't criticize me, but they don't talk about me, and they don't. I suggested many times that let's do some conversations and talk about degrowth and my interpretation. They always ignore and so on. So there's some like tension because we have very different understanding of Marxism and the Marx. So it's like this, like left wing people have more hesitation to accept degrowth ideas because they are more kind of traditional socialists, and they don't like my interpretation. So this is interesting, right? So like all the people who work in the big companies read my book and they kind of enjoy it, and then the left-wing people don't like my ideas because it's too degrowth is basically unpopular. So. So what I'm trying to do is basically first, so my project in Japan is basically to try to change the broader audience, the perception of socialism or communism or Marx. Many people do think that it was outdated, but then I try to update or present a new interpretation so that they think, oh, actually Marx is maybe kind of fun, maybe he's still important, and so on. Right? So that's one of my political intervention using this mainstream media. And the other thing is that I kind of gave up this Communist Party thing. So I try to go to more local communities and organic farmers, cooperative workers, and these care workers, and who are interested in that kind of issues of course, sustainability, ecology, but also care, and those issues that my idea has some relevance, right? So what I basically try to do is to join those movements who question the Marxist tradition, and that's how I try to build the new kind of wave of, it doesn't have to be Marxist. They don't think that they're Marxist, but they think that they try to do something beyond this infinite process of production and consumption under capitalism.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. Well, that's great. We're going to shift and turn to some questions outside of the reading group. So I've just approved one that should be visible. Let me just check.
Wait. Do people see it?
Published. Okay. I'll read it out. In Canada, we're seeing some Indigenous philosophers integrate political and ecological frameworks. For example, the name Leanne, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, Beta Samoske Simpsons a wonderful new book called Theory of Water. Do you have any thoughts on the compatibility or the overlap between Marxism and indigenous modes of thought?
That's something, yes, Marx was trying to think because, as I discussed in my book, he was interested in the Iroquois Federation and the issue basically that, the history of Iroquois Federation basically represents is that how they had a much more sustainable relationship with more gender equality, and they had an equal relationship and so on, was basically colonized, uh, dispossessed of the land, creating this patriarchal system and so on. And this is really something that Marx was witnessing in other societies like India and Iran and so on and so on. And then this is also something that what we are continuing to witness in Gaza and so on, right? So these are the issues. I think it's not that Marx was clearly talking about those indigenous ideas and he was trying to learn from indigenous philosophy. No, I mean, it's not like that. But at the same time, the fact that he was reading about those societies, that he was trying to fix some of his naive assumption about the superiority of the Western civilization and so on, that creates the foundation for more productive dialogue that with this mindset, I think we should learn from those indigenous philosophy too. And Marx was not able to do it because, of course, the resources were limited, and he never been to America and so on. But today we do have those resources, and I think there are a lot of common intersections. So I don't see any hesitation. I don't see any problem of incorporating those ideas. But then it didn't happen, right? I mean, it's not at least common thing. Why? It's basically because Marxists was so productivist, basically. So I think once you overcome this traditional view, it becomes so easy to, think about this kind of interactions and the mutual learning process. And it's almost looks strange for me now why it didn't happen before. But it really demonstrates how strong this image of productivist Marx was in the past.
Okay, we have another question on a different topic, a very brief kind of open-ended question. As artificial intelligence becomes increasingly popular, what impact do you think the ideas of degrowth are going to have?
Oh, I think, it's not really about degrowth, but one thing about degrowth is I'm not saying that we should totally abandon AI. Maybe we can still use some of them, and then we should still develop this technology. But I think today's this over competition is so absurd, and we should really ban or at least regulate this development because they're consuming so much energy and resources when we have to work hard for decarbonization, and it's really consuming human capacity and everything. This is just so much wasteful, right? But the thing that I'm so much more concerned about today is this is actually another topic that it's not directly related to my degrowth communism project, but this kind of like techno capitalism thing is really dangerous because it's way of controlling or even manipulating our desire. It's so strong, and the people basically asking questions AI, and they just believe AI, right? I mean, it's like recently, if you look at like Twitter or X, and then there's some like controversy, and then people simply ask AI if which side is correct, which one is true, and so on. So I mean, if the AI says, "Oh, this side is correct," and people do believe it, it's so easy to manipulate. I mean, we are just simply following what AI says and so on. And I think if this really becomes more and more powerful and more manipulative, it's so hard to imagine how some kind of like radical desires emerge out of this disaster. Because one other thing about AI is they are not so dangerous in terms of agitating like right-wing populist view. It's more like they are trying to be so neutral, and then their answers are often so kind of moderate. It's oh, some people say A, and the other people say B, and then we have to think carefully and so on. We don't have any space for radical ideas anymore. So I think that's I think one of the very dangerous things, that the people become so mediocre, people become so average, and then we lose all those revolutionary potentialities.
That's why Marx's work is still so important. So I have a longer question with multiple parts, or at least it was typed in parts. Thank you for your work, as ever, very interesting. A question I have is what your take on degrowth communism might mean for the mega city. Can degrowth scale up to the megapolis, or do most of us need to leave the city for the country? Can you say how you would distinguish degrowth communism from some of the versions of ecology that Marx knew and critiqued, like his friend Ernst Jones' Back to the Land movement? And how can this work for urban megacities where 2 acres per person, or so-called primitive communism, or a pre-capitalist, pre-industrial model is not an option? And how then is this higher form of production? That's another question. We'll stop at that.
Yeah, so I mean, if you're thinking about, like, I don't know, Mexico City or those mega cities in maybe something like more or less global south, India or something, the situation is very different. And first of all, the idea of degrowth is clearly limited to the global north, right? I'm not saying that African countries shouldn't grow because it's bad for the environment and so on. And they need to grow, but so that they can grow, the global north needs to decarbonize and degrow as fast as possible and so on. And the other thing is that basically I was writing in Japan, where the population is aging and then decreasing. So only now Tokyo is basically growing, and then the other towns and cities are shrinking basically, and then the many countrysides are, almost really dying out and so on. So in that sense, I think degrowth is not something that we should like build. It's more like already happening, but it's happening in an unplanned way. So, but what I'm trying to say is basically we really need to plan, because it's really changing the demographic and the population. Everything is now shifting in an opposite direction, and then the entire society is based on the assumption of continuous growth, and it doesn't work. And I think that also creates the possibility of downscaling the cities, including cities like Tokyo, because it's overpopulated and so on. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to go back to all those mountains and countryside. So I think it's, but maybe it's different in India or in other parts of the land, where the population is still growing, and then the mega cities are really still chaotic. And so in that sense, my perspective is clearly limited. But what I wanted to say is basically it's not necessarily all the time to go back to those kind of primitive, go back to nature, to the Ernest Jones kind of life. It's also not very efficient. It's good to have certain concentration, not like a megalopolis, but it's, I mean, some kind of walkable city, like a 15-minute city that is like a European example. There are many, and then like American suburb life is very wasteful in that sense. So it's the balance, and I'm not an expert, so I cannot point out what kind of way and how we can make the transition, but the basic model is some kind of middle between this today's megalopolis and then the primitive land movement.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I wanted to ask a question, my own question, which is a bit of a speculative question, invites imagination and alternative history. I just find it very interesting and striking that Marx changed so significantly later in his life. It's quite impressive, and to his credit, that he didn't just continue repeating the same things he had said all his life, which he could easily have done that, and many do. I mean, I think there could be a book written about the most radical changes that any philosophers have taken in their own lifetime or towards the end of their own lifetime. And certainly, I think based on what I've now learned about Marx in his later years, is that's quite a significant shift. So a real credit to him. But it's led me to wonder. So he didn't publish this, right? You're working on these volumes of the collected works. So they're notebooks he wrote and maybe letters he wrote to others, but he didn't publish. So the imaginary experiment is, can you imagine what would have happened if he had written, for example, a short, accessible second manifesto, a manifesto, an eco manifesto of some sort, a degrowth manifesto or something that was equally short, equally compelling, equally accessible to people? Can you imagine alternative history if he had done that, or I wonder sometimes if he deliberately chose not to do that because it would have undermined his project. If he had done that, it would have been a bit too much. Like, for example, I know people involved in fighting climate change, and they're really targeting oil companies rather than farmers. Farms, cows, they produce, terrible gases for the environment. But if you start telling everyone to become a vegetarian and you start putting farmers out of business, then the project of addressing climate change is really going to be, doubly, more difficult. So strategically, it may be better just to focus on oil production and consumption. So maybe Marx, was coming to these realizations later in his life and thinking, I wonder if I should write another manifesto, and then deciding not to because of the potential, undermining of the movement.
Yeah, so I think the one moment in his life that comes to closest to what you just said is the moment when he wrote the letter to Bela Dasuluc when she asked what Marx actually thinks about this Russian development to socialism, and he prepared 3 drafts. 2 of them are quite long, but the actual letter that he sent was quite brief, simply saying that, my analysis is limited to the Western countries and the Russia has its own path and so on. And the reason why he didn't send this longer version of his earlier letters is that maybe he thought that because it creates some political problem in Russia, because he knew that Bela Dasuluc was actually more advocating of modernization in Russia, and he didn't want to actually support that kind of group by telling them that how Russia should do, and then so on, so on. So he basically just answered in a very diplomatic way, just a very short reply answering the question without explaining why and so on. So in that sense, yes, he was always thinking in a political way, and he, I think, wanted to write something on ecology and so on if he lived longer, but his entire project was in a really difficult situation, and became, I said it's unfinished, as if he was able to finish and he passed away before he was able to finish. But maybe you could even say that it was unfinishable because it just changed so much. The situation, especially after the 1870s, was also changing because of the development of capitalism in the USA, but also like Russia, and everything really changed, and international capitalism. So many things happened after the 1870s. So, I mean, in that sense, yeah, it was unfortunate that Marx wasn't able to give more detailed explanation about his changes. Right? So actually, but the other point that I wanted to say is, even if Marx didn't write about Degrowth communism, many people did, like Kropotkin. He did really talk about degrowth communism, but also people like William Morris. His view was quite eco-socialist and even compatible with degrowth, I would say. But these ideas were there. They published many things, but so marginalized in the course of 20th century. So I think one of the reasons is basically that this how the Soviet scientific Marxism, state socialism became dominant in the course of 20th century, so dominant that other non-traditional socialists were categorized simply as utopian and then forgotten and criticized and denounced and so on. So maybe if Marx wrote something about ecology and about degrowth, he would have been simply abandoned and criticized. The late Marx was so wrong, he was sick, he was crazy, and so on. And then maybe this something, the Stalin justified anyway that the modernization was the only path and so on.
We have two great questions that I've been really torn about, so I'm going to ask both, and you can answer them in as much detail as you like, or just one or the other. So the first is brief and kind of provocative, and going back to the discussion of communism. So is your use of communism performative instead of descriptive, or I guess maybe rhetorical and strategic, like we were saying earlier, to differentiate from easily adopted projects within the capitalist structure? So the question was kind of asked at around that point in our conversation. Are you just being performative and adopting the use of the word communism? The other question is, also provocative, have left-wing parties missed the opportunity to embrace degrowth as a utopian idea that people could rally behind? People like Elon Musk promise big things, such as the colonization of Mars. The left struggles to offer such, quote, grand visions.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think, yes, so the left wing needs to be bold. And then since, I sometimes don't understand why socialists are afraid of being unpopular by talking about degrowth when they are so already unpopular, right? I mean, it doesn't really matter so much that they become a little more unpopular because they are already quite unpopular. And I think maybe they have more chance when they become more radical and even sometimes crazy, like Elon Musk or Donald Trump. And then, I mean, I don't understand with the, I mean, I don't, of course, agree with their politics, but then they have this capacity to kind of create some excitement and I don't know, maybe some kind of imagination and so on, right? But then I think that today's problem is that our imagination and the excitement are so confined to these technological breakthroughs and innovations. I think we can, of course, have many social innovations, and it's not necessarily that those cars, those self-moving cars that are path breaking, because I think the bicycles, they are old, but they can be super innovative for decarbonization, right? So these are the things that I think we should have more in through this kind of social innovation and so on. But yeah, in that sense, we should still talk about that kind of attractive innovation, bold ones that really transform the world. And I think degrowth can be one of those exciting ideas. And this is something that unpopularity of degrowth is in that sense not because of its nature. I would say, I think if many people come up with creative, interesting ideas of degrowth and how they can be implemented and so on, I think people will be more and more interested, right? So I think these utopian projects shouldn't be given up so fast. I think there are possibility to explore more, even though it's still quite unpopular.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, my idea of communism is in a sense, performative maybe, but also descriptive. I mean, it's based on some historical discussions and historical legacies of Marxist and socialist tradition, but at the same time, it's not simply that you can keep saying the old ideas. I think it's important to, reinterpret things or reformulate things in today's context. It's many ideas that I discuss. It's not like my original ideas. There are people who already discussed these things, already Castoriadis, Andre Goltz, and also on so on. But I think they have been kind of forgotten in the last 30, 40 years, last 30 years, maybe 20 years. But it's good to bring them back to the contemporary context and then try to update them with new discussions on climate change and so on. So I think that's something I'm trying to do with communism too. This old concept with many bad images, but then if you a little bit change and then put it in the current context, that can be still inspiring and attractive. And this is something that we should do with other concepts too.
Good. Well, I think that might be a good point for us to end. Thank you again so much for joining us. It really has been quite an extraordinary year, reading this book closely, month by month, chapter by chapter, and the debates and discussions we had, and my own changes in my views of Marx and Marxism. Still, like I said, quite impressive that he would have such a significant shift later in his life to kind of add a new level or a new type of relevance to our current context. And thank you to the participants in the reading group for your questions beforehand, and thank you to the general audience who added multiple questions during our discussion, and apologies we couldn't get through all of them. So thank you again very much, and look forward to reading what you've alluded to, another book you're working on right now, as well as the volume 17. So we'll look forward to those publications in the future. Maybe not the near future, but the future anyhow.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was so much fun. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.